Thank you very much, Helen, and thank you to all of you for joining this first morning session. When I was appointed as a Carnegie Fellow, and I should start by thanking Carnegie UK Trust for giving me time to think about a really tricky issue. I could have chosen an easier one, but I went for this. I went around talking to lots of people, many of you in this room and many further afield. And the reaction to the word kindness in public policy has stayed with me. There's the slightly embarrassed squirm, oh my God, she's going to be talking about emotions now. There's the shrug, kindness, really? Have you seen what's going on in our service, whether it's housing or care or health? There's the, that's nice, the front line needs to be so much kinder. If only we could get our highly skilled, extremely low-paid staff to be kinder, how much better my service activity would be. There's the, that's cheap. That would help me balance my budget if people in communities were so much kinder. There's increasingly, over the last 2 years, been, oh yeah, everyone's talking about that, we get that. And what I want to talk about this morning is why kindness and emotional literacy is so difficult. Because it's easy to say all of those things. It's easy to say it's nice. It's easy to say that your frontline staff, mainly working at the very edge of their autonomy, should do a little bit more of that. And I am sick to the back teeth of hearing stories about care workers on the living wage who stay an extra half hour and do a bit of free work. That happens all over all of your services, and it's wonderful. I'm interested in what it is in our public policy that makes it possible for us to reconcile yesterday's two themes of data, which I want to talk about, and emotions and relationships. Because there are lots of very good reasons not to be kind. It's not a straightforward thing. Children in playgrounds talk about things being kind and fair. But by and large, when we become responsible for big, complex activities, it's not language we feel comfortable with, hence the squirm. We're nervous about kindness, and I think rightly so, because everything we do is open to public scrutiny. And so discretion, autonomy, doing an extra favor for somebody because you like the way they look or because they speak to you in a way you understand is probably not subject to good public scrutiny. We have embraced quite properly high levels of regulation, and regulation is rules-based, and rightly so, and it protects and has transformed in positive ways so much of what we've done. We have professional boundaries to protect ourselves, and we need protecting. People working in all the services you're responsible for are under enormous strain and need to be able to create boundaries around them, and the very word professional entails a sort of detachment, a sort of rules-bound approach which understands where you are and what you're doing and what the difference is between you and what you might call your patient, your client, your service user, your tenant. Doesn't really matter what you call them. You've got a professional boundary and you understand it. We've been under massive pressure to demonstrate value for money, and rightly so. And we have developed complex, overarching evidence bases to understand what intervention will lead to what outcome, by and large, for the majority of people. And overall, and of all of that, we have a core value of fairness, a sense that what is equal should be equally available, and that the treatment people get should be equal. These are all strong, and I think powerful arguments for why kindness is not easy, not something we should just shrug our shoulders and say, yeah, wouldn't that be lovely? We need to recognize the challenge it poses. And Paul Bloom has written, an American author, written a fascinating book, Against Empathy, where he argues that actually we don't want the state to be kind. We want the state to be cool, dispassionate, detached, operate on the basis of the best evidence, and not worry about all this warmth and relational stuff you talked about. I parody a rather interesting book, but there we go. All of this is an almost comedic view of what's really going on. It's almost hilarious to understand that we have created this entire infrastructure of regulation, of scrutiny, of transparency, of fairness, of professionalism. And actually, we're not delivering very much of that. We all know that better off people get a better service. That if you are like me and you are very like in demography, the doctors and GPs you see, middle-aged women who speak a bit like me, I get a better service. We know that the relationships make a huge difference. We know that poorer people and people who have very different starting points get a less good service. We, at least all of us in this room, and looking around at the demography here, I guess you're all like me, we have all fought like Rottweilers for our parents to get the right attention, and we've mainly succeeded, and we know many, many people don't. So we know we are operating in a system that doesn't deliver that fairness, that isn't open to that sort of scrutiny, that has in it huge inequality. And what I've identified in this work is that actually in our modern day, with all the challenges we've got, it's not good enough to say that all of those bulwarks of regulation, scrutiny, transparency, professionalism will protect us and enable us to continue to run big and complex services. And the reason it's not good enough is because what we're having to do, and I don't need to tell anyone in this room, is so much more complicated and so much more challenging that we need different approaches, and we need to be able to weave together some different approaches. We know that the extraordinary diversity which all of our services, and I speak not as a health service insider, but someone who's run social care and housing services, increasingly for 5 generations, that's what many of our services are meeting. For families in extremely different formations from the ones envisaged back in those glory days of 1945, with extremely different levels of wealth, income, capacity, and ability. We know about that diversity, and you will have had it rehearsed enormously. We know that trust is the most precious currency any of us ever have. Your buildings, your assets, your balance sheets are all currency worth having, but the trust people have in the services they receive, the services we all receive, is an extraordinarily important currency. And we know that trusted institutions of all sorts and in all markets are failing and are struggling and are losing support because of it. We know that how we behave determines what we get. And we know that there are marked differences in place, that the differences between the experience of somebody growing up in Hartlepool, where I ran services for a long time, or in York, where I happen to live, is entirely different. And for those reasons, I think we need to adopt a relational approach, which I've called kindness, but actually it's about the sort of emotional intelligence that brought many of you into this way of working, but our systems have made extraordinarily difficult to manage. And I say this because I believe that public service is always and everywhere about emotions. It's about relationships and it's about emotions. There is no bit of public service that is that lovely, cool, clean, easy to understand and easy to dice and slice world. Look at how we all feel, and I will use the we because I try not to say they. Look at how we all feel about our homes, the places that we live, the places which are the most precious place for everybody in this room. Look at, therefore, how deeply shocking domestic violence is, because it invades the sanctity of the home. How desperate it is for people when there is flooding or internal sewage flooding in their homes. What that means and what it does is not the incident reported to the water company. It is the domestic tragedy that affects people so profoundly. Look at why burglary is such an extraordinarily violent crime and violating crime. And yet our housing policy talks about the numbers of units we need and where they need to be. We find it extremely hard to engage with the emotional resonance of home. Look at registered care homes and nursing homes, which is some of my responsibility in the past. We know that people using care homes, particularly in later life, are entering what they have perceived to be the dread destination for a very long time. They're suffering enormous fear, a sense of huge loss, usually of their family home, nearly always of their life partner. They're suffering grief. And yet I have seen notes that say, Mrs. Unwin is not settling in very well. How unsurprising is that when you think of the personal tragedy that person is going through? Look at the big public health challenges of childhood obesity. And again, I put my hands up to some responsibility for this. I worked at the Food Standards Agency, and I was the chair there when we were doing a lot of work on childhood obesity. And we told people what they should eat and that 5 a day was better than nothing and that donuts weren't good for you. We didn't engage with how mothers show their love for their children. We didn't engage with that issue of what the home and the kitchen and feeding people means. People tried to, but in the end, it was so much easier to say, I can't even remember how many milligrams of salt it was, but 5 a day stays with me. It was so much easier to broadcast the evidence and not understand the motive, and the motives which remain hugely problematic, because how we feed our children is so often how we show our love. And finally, and this sounds like a confession, I've worked in regeneration of places, and I know the language to use, and I know how to get results in regeneration. And yet I very rarely hear people talking about the stories people tell about where they live, the smell of home, what it feels like where you live, what the music's like, what's the accents like, who knows who, and where the networks are. I've worked in places where we have put bus routes in frankly ludicrous places because we weren't listening to the very detailed warp and weft of those communities. And so for all of those reasons, I think it's incredibly important that we focus on what I've described as the twin lexicons. And you have, I've deliberately done this without slides and now I'm regretting it. On your table, I've given you copies of my publication, and on page 10, there are the two lexicons. There's the Rational Lexicon, which I bet we can all talk in this room for hours. I think we're already fluent in rational. I'm going to place a bet, because I'm pretty good at it, where we talk about balance, safe, fair. We use words like scrutiny and value for money. We risk being a bit cold, a bit detached, and maybe getting it wrong, but we have outcomes which are easily understood, easily explained. And people who are fluent in rational, in my experience, are very much better paid, and very often have positions of quite a lot of power and do rather well. But there are people who are fluent in relational lexicon too. People who talk about grief and sadness and love and anger and hate, the words we all probably use at home, but we don't tend to use at work. They talk about desire and storytelling and what people really want. Now, I don't think either of these lexicons are on their own good enough. If you only talk relational, if that's your only lexicon, you will be populist, you'll be sentimental, you'll make very easy decisions which suit one person but not the majority. If you only talk rational, you may not make the right decision at all. You may not be hearing what's really going on. I've argued in this small pamphlet that we need to all start to be a little bit more bilingual. And why does it matter now? In a sense, it's always mattered. It's always mattered how we build the relationships. But we are at a time of enormous change and enormous stress across public services. And it is no surprise to me that in the UK, but outside England, there is a real focus now on the global drive about well-being. Go to Scotland, go to Wales, go to Northern Ireland. The notion of societal well-being is becoming ever more transparent in the government of those countries. It is no surprise to me, and it's partly because of this work and others like it, that the Scottish National Performance Framework now pledges to its citizens, you can hold us to account for kindness. It's no surprise to me there's a global movement on well-being, because if we are to deliver the outcomes we need to deliver, we need to start behaving better. We need to start being more bilingual, because we know, and we'll all know this from our own experience, that there are things that get in the way, and very often it's that rational lexicon that gets in the way. If we're going to build trust, we need to start talking and thinking differently. If we're going to deliver better outcomes and actually deliver some change, we need to make those deep connections with people, both across our services, within them, and with the people we exist to serve. But I'd say far more than that. I think if we're going to make progress on any of the really major social policy issues of our time, we need to start talking differently. We have, and I know you spent some time yesterday talking about the future of social care. I quite like to drop the social. The future of care and how we care for people who need it is bedeviling this country and all of our systems. And we know there's horrific headlines that talk about the time bomb. What an insulting way to talk about all of us, because every household in this country is affected by the provision or otherwise of care. But we also know something more. We know it's difficult. Of course it's difficult. We know the money's going to be hard. Of course it is. We've dealt with other issues. I think there's something else going on. I think we're embarrassed to talk about care. I talked one day to a very senior journalist in a very big broadsheet paper, and I will go no further than this, who said to me, I sort of get what you're talking about, but talk to higher-ups here. Alpha men, they don't want to talk about their fear of aging. They don't want to talk about vulnerability. They don't want to talk about what's happening next to all of us. They're happy to talk about the care time bomb, but they are very less happy to talk about what's happening. And I think that sense of fear, disgust, shame bedevils all of us in public policy. I think we find it hard to engage with the fact that we will all need care, that many of us have needed care in our lives, that this is not about them, it's about us, and that currently the structures and processes we've got don't fill anyone with confidence about the dignity and respect as they age. Speak to anyone, and I speak as an aunt and advocate of someone with profound and multiple learning disabilities. The grief is not that child was born. The pain is not raising a child with huge personal difficulties. The pain and the grief are dealing with our systems and our processes. And that's simply not good enough. That's what we have created. I think, for all sorts of good and rational reasons, but I think we need to examine our relational feelings about it too. And I think the fear, that's never going to happen to me, is a deeply profound one. But if I say that there is not a household in this country not affected by the absence or presence of care, I think I'm telling the truth. I think it's right. So how we deal with those really big challenges requires us to be bilingual. But it's not just that. It's also the digital revolution, and I'm so pleased that the words digital and relationships raised yesterday so profoundly, because I think that is challenging us all enormously. The digital capacity that you will have at your fingertips, and Lord knows you'll have even more by the time I've finished speaking, because the pace of change is so fast, has been transformative and has the potential to transform even more. It has also transformed our modes of communication. And the notion that they, the users of services, are, if they ever have been, silent recipients, is something that all of you know is simply not true anymore. The movements and networks that the inquiry I chaired into the future of civil society drew attention to, but you all knew about them anyway, are powered by a form of digital communication that gives voice to the voiceless, and it's pretty uncomfortable to be on the receiving end of it. But read Sarah Ryan's book about the tragic death of her son, Connor Sparrowhawk. And for all her anger, which I would share and completely understand, for all her fury, which I would completely understand, she mobilized a campaign that didn't touch the major charities led by people who look like all of us in this room, but was powered by a sense of solidarity and grief. I think things are changing really fast, and I think we need to wake up and focus on them. The third reason I think this really matters is because our communities are changing fast. There is, in every community in this country, the growth, I'd say more than the growth, the explosion of new forms of organising. Dementia Friends, Spare Room for Syrian Refugees, Night Stop, where young people are being given a place to stay, friendship groups for people, circles of support for people with learning disability. Now, these could all fit into your that's nice, that's cheap box, if you want. But they are also massive expressions of solidarity, of a sense that what we're doing now is not right. For every Macmillan coffee morning, raising money is an expression of solidarity. And I think we should listen carefully to what those groups will be saying. If you work for Immigration and Nationality Department, you've tried to deport somebody in Glasgow in the last few years, you've met the full fury of the community and the churches there. They know that they have to be engaged with that relational stuff that's going on because people have built coalitions of support that have made the operation of the state very difficult. And the final reason I think this really matters now is because the search for intelligence and for understanding what's happening in our communities could not be more important. The things that have rocked your budgets, the budgets of local authorities, and the governance and sense of status and stature of many of our institutions were all predictable if you were listening carefully enough and if you were displaying the levels of emotional intelligence that I think are required in a modern and difficult age. Think of the child sexual exploitation cases in some of our northern towns. They were known about by people close to those girls in care. They were not reported and they were not acted on, and they have rocked those local authorities. Think of the explosion of knife and gun crime in some parts of our cities. Who knows when that's starting? Who knows when there's difficulty going on that estate? The people closest to those communities. And who knew about the fury of parents of children who were being kept in assessment units until they started to get voice? So the gathering of intelligence seems to me to not be the cool, hard scanning that you will all do all the time. It is also that very acute listening. So that's why it matters now, because community activity is a call for change, and there is a response there. There is a real risk of division. But it's going to change further, and this is where I'll come to an end. I know that the algorithm is changing the way Amazon and Tesco's sell to me. I was presenting at a conference recently where somebody said, "You're completely overstating the power of artificial intelligence. Nothing's going to change for the next 10 or 20 years. I don't know if that's right or not. I know that 10 or 20 years feels pretty soon to me. And I know that many of our decisions are now being made in ways which provide the clarity, provide the certainty, but we may not yet have the confidence to override them, to intervene in them, and to make sure they're noticing the things that we think matter. What is the nature of the algorithm that recognizes not just tick the box, she's got social networks, cross the box, she hasn't? What is the algorithm that tells you how deep and powerful those social networks are or how shallow they are? What is the algorithm that will tell you when you admit someone to your hospital that actually she's been subject to coercive control for a very long time by that loving husband who seems to accompany her all the time? Where will we find the institutional confidence in the public square to say our closeness to our communities, our knowledge of our patients, our understanding of our residents enables us, indeed forces us to do something rather different? I think if this wise man who knows more than I is right, it's 10 to 20 years. Now's the time to start getting the knowledge and the confidence to say that actually all of our services are about emotions. They're all about relationships. That's why most of us are in this business. Unless we reclaim some of that relational approach, we will be fishing in a pool which we won't understand. We will be developing services in places which we can't comprehend. We will be providing services for people which they will not use appropriately, and they will mess up our timetables. We will be trying to drive behaviour change for people who will simply not be listening. And yet, if we could become a bit more bilingual, a bit more acutely understanding of what's really going on in our communities, we could make such powerful changes. I think the failure to do so will result in a loss of trust, and I think that will be catastrophic. It will result in the wrong decisions being made at the wrong times, and I think that will be disastrous. And what is more, I think it could make us rather irrelevant, because I think the solidarity being shown in communities will continue and will grow, will get angrier, and will be a call for change, which we, in our institutions, speaking rationally, may not be equipped to respond to. Thank you very much.
That was fantastic, Julia.
Thank you.
One of the things that struck me as I was reading your report originally, and I started thinking about it again yesterday, particularly in the session on social care, was the kind of triple challenge that leaders in local systems of the NHS are facing at the moment, where they're having to think about how they work together and how their organisations work together differently, and moving from a market, albeit a very artificial and managed market environment, to an environment where they're being asked to collaborate and cooperate. And at the same time, they're being asked to develop different relationships with the citizens that they serve. And at the same time, they're dealing with the financial challenge and the workforce challenge that we talked about yesterday. So I'm kind of interested in your thoughts about how being bilingual in those two lexicons, the relational and the rational, might help local leaders develop those conversations.
Well, systems leadership is really interesting on this, isn't it? Because it's always about relationships, about friendships, about who you can work with. It's about working across. And forgive me, I've said this already at the table here, but I'm always struck by how the word collaboration means two things. In wartime, to be a collaborator is not great. It is disloyal. It involves betrayal. And actually, we have invested massively in organisational loyalty and a sense of belonging to your organisation. And we are now asking people to betray a little, to, in a bigger cause, and I think quite a proper cause, to cross those boundaries, to trust each other in different ways. And we know that trust builds up over time. It's never easily acquired. I don't think I've ever trusted someone I met across a boardroom table until we'd been through the fire a bit, and probably when we'd done something different as well. Boardrooms are not the best place to develop trust. And yet we need to do it. Many members of the public, and we are all members of the public, look at other institutions. Think about how many of you think about the banks and think, oh yeah, they all trust each other. That's great. They're all having posh dinners together, going to conferences together and plotting against us. There is something about how we do our sharing, our collaboration in an open way, in a way that can be seen and can be understood. And increasingly in our difficult times, we need to be even more open. And that's even more scary, because you are taking those tentative jumps. I can work with the Director of Adult Social Care here, even though we haven't got a great deal in common except the population we serve, which is quite a lot. But I think we're going to need to learn how to do it. And I think being more bilingual enables you to talk in ways that the public can understand, because the public will see conspiracy where they see obscurity and secrecy. And that's the thing we have learned through other big scandals in other bits of industry. I think your point about doing this at a time of incredible financial challenges is a point we should never skirt away from. And I was conscious as I stopped speaking that I'm not sure if I registered that as clearly as I think we need to. If you look at what's happened to local authorities across the country, it is impossible to have a conversation with local government who are part of our systems without understanding what's happened. It's also impossible not to recognise the huge innovation that has led to and the very different behaviours that are going on. So although I know many of your tweeters do not tweet me saying this because I get into trouble, there is something about how that has changed behaviours in the most trying and difficult circumstances, and I think it's worth hanging on to.
Yeah, very good, thank you. So, over to you. Questions from the audience? Is that Sharon in the middle there?
It is.
And Jeremy at the back? Sharon and then Jeremy?
Thank you very much, Julia. That was absolutely fantastic. And a lot of what you were talking about kind of reminded me of community development work.
Yeah.
And that's what I did when
Me
I was
too.
a newly qualified social worker many years ago. My question is about how you think kindness can help us with some of the very real workforce challenges that we talked about yesterday. So we know that in social care, turnover rates, or rather churn, is horrendous at 32% on average across the piece. And yet we also know there are providers who have retention rates of 90% or above. And so Skills for Care did a piece of work called Secrets of Success that looked at what are the ingredients, and they were nothing majorly surprising, and you might encapsulate them as kindness, as leaders who treat their colleagues with humanity and respect, person-centred from the other side of the coin maybe. And yet the NHS survey came out and said people didn't feel their employers were investing in their health and well-being, and there's still reports of bullying. So how do we bring kindness into the way we lead and work with one another?
Should we take Jeremy's question as
Yeah,
well?
of course.
Hi, Jeremy Taylor. I'm just stood down as Chief Executive of National Voices, and for the past few years I've been advocating for citizen voice in health and care, but also the role of the voluntary and charity sectors in supporting citizens. And it's really interesting listening to your fascinating lecture, because I think the charity sector straddles both of the languages. Some of our sector are very much in the kind of community organising solidarity space, and some are more in the rational space, and some are a mixture. And some charities have seen a decline in trust as a result of various things that have happened in the last few years. I'd be very interested in your views on what are the challenges of your analysis to the voluntary sector, and how it needs to respond to the fact that there are things going on that to some extent have outpaced the more traditional charity model.
Oh, good. Gosh, you do ask good questions. I was told you would, but you do. Yes, Sharon, I too started in community development decades ago, so yes. I think there is a huge body of evidence about what works in terms of staff engagement. And I think some of what we've ignored in public service to our detriment. In terms of social care, I cannot proceed without saying that low pay is trapping people and their lives in poverty in ways that you couldn't imagine. And that when I was responsible for running very small amounts of residential care and we moved people to the living wage, our turnover plummeted. That's partly early adopters. There were fewer places for them to go. I'm not sure what would happen if everybody paid. But it did, and sickness levels dropped. Who knew? If I was worried about how I was going to pay my bills, if I was worried about how I'd pay the person looking after my children, of course I'd go sick. Of course sickness levels go. We only have to imagine what it would be like to understand what extreme levels of poverty, which is what's the lifestyle facing many, many people working in our services, what that does. But over and above that, the research evidence about workforce engagement is clear. Levels of autonomy, levels of agency really matter to people. They matter as much as everything else. The ability to organise your own work, organise your shifts, do things in the way that suits you and your family makes a huge difference. And your publication, Secret Success, showed that the better employers were the ones who, within the limits of what you can do, managed to be responsive to their staff needs. But I am deeply troubled, and this goes to Jeremy's point as well, about the allegations, well, the reality of bullying and bad behaviour in our services. Because as a response to troubled times, it couldn't be a worse response. It's an understandable, it's a human response, and when people higher up feel under pressure, the pressure is always felt at the front line. But if it's depriving people of that sense of agency and autonomy, we are ignoring entirely the evidence which says that's what keeps people happy and motivated at work. We're failing to learn from other industries and what they're doing. And particularly when we talk about the front line in social care, I think we have to recognise that people come into it because of care, because of kindness, because of the relationships, because they want to work close to home, because they are part of a neighbourhood and a community. And too many of our systems and structures break that up sequentially and make it far more difficult for people to feel that reward. Jeremy, you will know that I've just completed chairing an inquiry into the future of civil society. And I'd love to say that I think charities are much further ahead on this than anyone else, and I don't think it's true. I think the sector, the civil society, charity sector in its broader sense, is as divided on these issues of, well, I'm slightly parodying it, but the rational and the relational. And I think there are new entrants into civil society and long-standing organisations which absolutely build on solidarity, on it's about us, it's not about them, on developing strong and permanent relationships. And there are others who, for all sorts of reasons, risk becoming deliverers of service. which is not the same as building the social capital that I think you're talking about. And in those institutions, some of them do that extraordinarily well, as I'm sure many of you do, but they struggle just as much with the retention of the right staff, with getting their values all the way through the organisation, and ensuring that they are continuing to be as emotionally intelligent as they need to be, while they're very intelligently getting the rest of their plans going. So I don't think there is a place where this is completely accepted. I think it's a journey, not a destination, to use yet another cliche.
Thank you. More questions? Peering hard. Jocelyn, and then gentleman at the back in the pink shirt, and lady at the back in the grey top. And I've seen two other hands as well, so we'll come back to the next time.
Thank you very much. I thought that was fabulous. I wanted to ask you your thoughts on how people in senior leadership positions actually become bilingual. Apart from reading wonderful reports like your report. I'm involved in spreading Schwartz-Rounds into the NHS, and we've had one round, a demonstration round with senior executives in Manchester recently, which was a closed shop just for them. And the three people who spoke from the panel to begin with all told stories of being bullied at work themselves. They all told stories about how tough it was for them to admit to any kind of emotion in the settings in which they work, and how this was the first occasion they had ever talked in a personal way at work. And it just strikes me that you'll talk about the alpha male, and so on, which is, of course, a stereotype, but actually, audiences like this, and most of the audiences that I know are, as you say, deeply, deeply uncomfortable with all the emotional side of stuff, and they live in a context which makes it incredibly hard to recognize and accept it and validate it. And so I think we need to go beyond words and find processes and practices to help people change, and I'm very interested to know what you think they might be.
Thank you.
My name is Masood Fuladi. I'm a medical director of Circle. I came to UK 40 years ago purely because of civil liberty of UK. That was the only reason I came here. I was absolutely amazed the impact of equal opportunity legislations totally transformed UK, and I've lived through it. My question to you is how you see the society has moved, particularly over the last 15 years. Is it more kind or less kind? I see Daniel Blake, working class white man from north of England, has to interact with the system and is demonized. And I see a black African refugee in Kent come to my clinic with a handcuff, which I was not treated 40 years ago under Thatcher. So I think the temperature of society then filters up to the leaders. And I just want to know, based on your experience, are we in the right direction or we go wrong direction?
That's a big question. And one more at the back there.
Oh, blimey.
Yeah, and then we'll let Julia answer those three, and then there were at least two more hands I saw, which I've noted, and we'll come back to.
Thank you. It's Merryn Simpson from the New NHS Alliance, and thank you, Julie, for your presentation. The lady who just spoke a moment ago asked how we can become bilingual and felt the need for processes. And I think the thought going through my head is, how do we apply this? And it feels as though it's not just business as usual plus kindness or plus bilingualness. It must result in service redesign, and it must go further because it must change the way that we do things. And the New NHS Alliance has been working and grappling with this for some time. We have a framework now around, we call it health creation, but it's really can be used to redesign services. But one of the key things is that you need people, citizens in the room with you, talking those other languages. And we need to listen and we need to respond. We need to be prepared to hear the truth and tell the truth with people. We need to focus on their strengths, what they can do, not what they can't do. So an asset-based model. We need to understand that the community has as an asset because of the networks within the community. And we need to be prepared to give away a bit of power, so there's power shifting. And I think that is sort of kindness with teeth, and how it can actually result in changing the way we do things. Some people call it co-production, that's part of it. I haven't mentioned that word, I haven't heard that word mentioned this morning, but I just wondered if, there's further to go on this, and this is, we need to find ways of making it percolate throughout our services and actually change the way that we are and the way that we do things.
I'm going to try and address all three together, which is brave and probably a bit foolish, but
Very
hey,
impressed.
let's have a go. I think all those questions are about process, but they're also about tone and behaviour. And tone from the top is talked about far too much. I'm deeply uncomfortable talking about this stuff. I was raised not to ever talk about the personal, just to get on with it, to pretend that wasn't happening, and I suspect all of you were. That's our professional upbringing. What I'm describing here goes to the heart of how we design our services. And I don't think this is a toolkit or a quick fix or just a nice set of words. I've described it as deeply disruptive because it changes the relationship between the citizen and the state. And it says, we are all citizens here. I've written a lot about how we frame discussions. This is about us, it's not about them. And what we know, even last week, Caroline Criado Perez's book about how design is affected by who's in the room speaks absolutely to the concerns that you have. She talks really compellingly about why the airbags in cars don't work to protect women, because they are always tested on people of a different shape and size. How many times have we done that in our design processes? What you get out of any design is determined by who's in the room and the questions you're answering. And yes, we have moved very far on diversity, and that is huge. Clearly what Caroline's talking about has not happened in other bits of industry we have. But I'm not sure if we've moved very far on who's in the room when we make the difficult design decisions, which we all know we're part of. And how we set the tone and what we talk about matters. Now, when I started this work, I went to talk to a very reputable think tank leader who said, kindness, what you mean is relational welfare. And I thought, no, I don't really mean relational welfare, because for once I want to use language which I can talk about, which actually names it and says this is what we mean. But of course, it's not just about being nice to people. It is about a different sort of relationship. It's a relationship of equals, where yes, Merrin, we are co-producing. And yes, people bring very different skills and history and understanding to the table. But one where we also recognise the skills and the history and the understanding that we bring to the table. In a different public policy environment, I've been very struck by how suddenly housing is getting quite high up the agenda. Now, I've worked in housing and homelessness for 40 years. I think one of the things that's changing is that by and large, none of our children can afford to buy anywhere. I think that's changing the terms of the debate. I think that's making people wake up and say, we've got a housing crisis. Now, I'm not proud. If that will also lead to action on homelessness and people who are perpetually locked out of housing, that's fine. I think that's changed things. I think we need to listen really acutely to those policy moments. I suspect, I'm not going to do it, I can't even see you to do it. If I did a poll here, there are a higher percentage of people in this room concerned about their parents. I suspect there are a higher percentage of people in this room who have children with a number of medical conditions, just because that's what the stats show. That's changing how we view what we do. And if we start to bring ourselves to work, we start to have different conversations on those things, and the policy climate changes. But actually, the way in which what we say is heard, and it's heard within our institutions, changes. But this issue about the harshness of the climate we're in is, I think, a really important one, and that's your question at the back. Daniel Blake, showed in very graphic terms, A, a level of community solidarity that I talked about, and B, a rather brutalized system. I can talk about sanctions for hours, I promise you I won't, Helen, but a brutalised system in which a worker acting at the edge of her autonomy in a kind way was then disciplined by the system. There is something about how we as systems leaders shape systems and feed back what the impact is of them, which makes us all responsible for a sanctions regime, which we know will be affecting people coming to your clinics, your GP practices, wherever you work. We do need to understand the impact of that harshness. And I think on disability, we are in a hostile environment, which is deeply troubling. On poverty, we are in a hostile environment. And undoubtedly, on migration and asylum, we are in a hostile environment. Now, you can't just make that easy by being kind. You can factor in the intelligence, the emotional intelligence that says, this means the people coming to see me are in a very different place, have very different life experiences than they would have had even 10 years ago.
Thank you, Julia. Now, I said I'd seen two hands already, so there was Andy and John. Take those two, and then we'll have time for, I think, probably two more. So Andy there.
Andy Cowper, Health Service Journal. You've talked about the risks of populism with regards to walking the tightrope between the rational and the relational. Given that new initiatives in this sector and many other sectors have a bit of a habit of overcompensation and the new trend, how would you suggest that people who are here today and who are watching or following this try and walk the line to avoid populism?
And John?
So it's not really a question for Julia, it's a question for us, actually. And Julia, you talked about complicated language, and as people in this room, we tend to use complicated language. So the question for us, it builds on Jocelyn's question. The NHS has a bullying culture, okay? It's had a bullying culture for at least the last 20 years. We had a discussion about workforce yesterday. We didn't even mention it. It's one of the reasons that we don't retain staff. And that bullying culture comes from the top. You know, the fish rots from the head. And it goes back to one of the points you made earlier, which is that people who succeed often don't really understand emotional intelligence. It just doesn't resonate. So you can talk about it all you like, but it just does not resonate. And there are other people who actually have it, who have been bullied, and they end up actually acquiescing. I mean, that's strongly evidence-based. So until we actually start facing up to that issue, then kindness isn't going nowhere.
Reflections?
I'm glad, Justin, you said that's for the room, because I'm going to say a few things, but I couldn't possibly answer it. One of the things I've said in this is there is no toolkit, there is no measurement, this is not an initiative. It's really important to me and to all sorts of people, and there are many in this room who are working on these issues, this is not something I've done alone, that we don't treat it as a new panacea. The reason I talk so much, and I went everywhere I go, I talk about it, there are good reasons to be rational. This is not something we're throwing out. There is an easy agenda that goes, it's all common sense, isn't it? Let's get rid of all this regulation and public scrutiny and just do what, I don't know, Dr. Kildare used to do and be nice to people. I don't know who it would have been. Actually, that doctor in Scotland, more probably. Why can't we go back to old-fashioned methods? And I absolutely reject that. We are dealing with much more complexity, quite properly much more scrutiny. And I, for one, I'm delighted that there's the sort of regulation that means when I'm in a care home, somebody will keep an eye on the medicines I get. You know, we have got to keep this in balance. I think what I'm saying is if we carry on one side of my lexicon, and don't understand the positions of people we work with as well as people we serve, we will continue to make the same mistakes and not achieve either the outcomes or the trust that we want. But there is a Daily Mail headline to be written here which I will resist, which is, if only we could all be like we were in the past, when it was all so much easier. Well, the world is completely different. The service users we're meeting are completely different. The needs are completely different. we needed to be doing something different. And although I'm trying to use ordinary language like kindness and not relational welfare, actually what we're talking about is a more emotionally attuned and a more emotionally confident response to the very big challenges of our time. And a recognition that, and this comes to Justin's point, that this is not straightforward. That for an organisation to have reported bullying levels of the sort that I know the NHS has, but so do so many other organisations, is, if nothing else, is anti-rational. It flies in the face of all the evidence about what matters most is getting staff who want to be where they are and are able to work at the very best of their capabilities. That evidence is not new. It's 30 years old that says that that sort of behaviour, the sort that you've described and that is well documented and people talk, flies in the face of all the evidence about how you motivate staff. It's dangerous. It results in very poor decisions, and I think you as a sector bear the scars of some extremely poor decisions made because people didn't feel they had a voice, didn't feel they were listened to, weren't listened to, weren't heard when they said things. And I think there's a question of public trust in this, because I don't think you can carry on making decisions and then just moving on to the next thing, initiative or otherwise.
Thank you, Julia. We've got 5 more minutes, so probably time for 2 questions. I can see Rob, I'm going to make it 3 because I've got 3 hands in my eye line. So Rob and Jeremy and the gentleman in the blazer there.
Hello, my name's Rob Webster. I'm a Trust Chief Executive and I lead a integrated care system or big partnership in West Yorkshire and Harrogate.
Yep.
Thank you for that presentation. That was wonderful. I also reject any suggestion that senior leaders don't show emotion or can't talk about their personal lives or bring their whole selves to work. I see it frequently in the work that I do every day. My comment really is that I spend a lot of time talking about how I lead an integrated care system, which is a set of relationships. A set of relationships between people in communities, our staff, the third sector, the NHS and councils. I don't run an organisation. And there's a constant need or desire on the system to try and impose an organisational structure on a set of relationships, which are actually driving some significant improvements. Because we're looking at, how do you support the 260,000 people who care for somebody because they love them? We're looking at how arts and health drives resilience in communities. We're looking at housing and health and the way that people mobilise around the streets and how you become more neighbourly. And this is all really good work, which is opening up, I think, a whole new vista. I think in the last 2 days, I've heard people talk about integrated care systems. Not at all. Hardly at all. Yet we've got an opportunity, I think, to take this blind spot and apply it to a way of mobilising all the work that we do to tackle the biggest issues that face us today. So maybe what we could do is take your fantastic work and say, how do we apply this to the 44 different sets of arrangements we want to put in place to really transform the lives of local people?
Yeah, thank you. Jeremy at the back.
Thank you. Jeremy Hughes from the Alzheimer's Society. It's really another reflection, which is how do we use our time when we talk to people in a useful way. So I met the Prime Minister sort of 18 months ago on the back of the fiasco of the 2017 election. And she was committed and interested in what we're doing on dementia. And she said, what do you want? And I said, well, I want you to become a dementia friend. And to actually give her credit, she then asked me to come and do a dementia friends session for the Cabinet. So I replaced prayers, I think, at the beginning of a Cabinet meeting. On hindsight, she probably needed the prayers. But what was interesting was, dementia friends were getting about 1,000 people a day becoming dementia friends in the local community. But it actually worked with the Cabinet as well.
Absolutely.
Because there was a role play exercise and because it touched a nerve about personal experience, and it's because something they never normally did, they actually engaged and they were emotionally charged up and they understood what it was about. And there's still ministers talking to me about it now, sort of 12 months later. So I think it's something about recognizing that if you touch the nerve of the emotional relationship and you engage with people upon what they in their normal lives want to engage with, rather than expecting them to be business people or health officials, you actually do get through and it actually sticks and it will make a difference.
Thank you, Jeremy. And one more very quick question and then Julia will give us her rapid reflections.
Sorry, yes, Jonathan Sargent. One of my roles is I'm one of the leaders and founders of NHS Collaborate, and I've spent the last 2 years working on providing a space that's relationship-based for primary care leaders across the country. And having worked with about 700 primary care leaders, I notice it's just human for us, and it's in us all, and it's all possible for us to care for each other and understand each other. You just need to create the space. And I think even the people in this room, if they create the space in their organisations and maybe replace some of the time where they do transactional conversations and pay attention to their working relationships and to who people are and what's going on in their lives, then actually you can start to put it in place. It's not difficult, and I was a bit perturbed by you saying this is a difficult thing to do. It's not. It's a natural thing to do. We've just come out of an industrialised era, and we are in a behavioural complexity space of running systems. And I wonder if you change your kindness and relationships, people to the word human and the importance of being human in work, make people less wince at, oh, this is about me and my feelings.
Julia, your very final reflections.
I'm delighted to hear quite a lot of what I've heard. Yes, Rob, I do know about the work you're doing, and it is very different, and there are, of course, lots of things going on that are different. And if I missed that, I'm sorry. Jeremy, I have heard so many times about the Dementia Friends in the Cabinet from people who went through it. What an amazing thing to have done. I have to say, there's a bit of a joke in my circles. Can you imagine when you're just at the early stages of dementia and what happens? Eric Pickles arrives and tries to be your friend. But I think it was an amazing initiative because, sorry, flippant remark, but there was a bit of a fear of that. I think what you demonstrate there is how solidarity is not confined to some people. Solidarity can be built in all sorts of ways, and I think that's incredibly important. But I think the stronger thing that all three of those points have made is, yes, there's nothing new in this, but there are voices that need to be heard and need to be brought into the room, which too often in our systems are driven out. And that we do have, and I'm no health expert, but I do think we drive out, we have a default, which is in times of stress, we drive it out. And I think what I'm urging is a focus on being human, of course, recognising that this is a shared endeavour, it's about all of us, and that there is something about citizenship and how we are as people, which is perhaps more significant and is more often reflected in the movements, which is really what you're talking about, Rob, rather than the institutions and organisations. This doesn't attach to individuals, but I think it does challenge individual leaders to keep focused on it. Because I know what it's like running a busy organisation. You are making decisions all the time. You are having to move to quick positions all the time. And all the pressures are against a recognition of our shared humanity. If we want to achieve the outcomes which are absolutely evident in this programme, we have to hang on to this. And I think there are spaces where it needs to be talked about more than it currently is. But thank you for listening.
Thank you, Julia, for a really fantastic opening to our second day.
Thank you.
Thank you.